All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our speaker here. So Keith Swanson is a longtime resident of Silicon Valley, playing various roles in software startups. He has a degree in physics and a master's degree in computer science. Keith is a co-author of more than 10 books on technology. His latest book, When Thinking Matters in the Workplace. He advises managers on how to use information systems to address the problems of complexity in organizations. He's a regular attendee to the ACSJ. And like many members, this is an area of personal interest and not specifically of one of expertise. So Keith is speaking tonight on the topic, A Question of Snowflakes, How the Universe Allows Things to Create Themselves. So please join me in welcoming Keith Swanson.
Okay, hello and good evening. It's an honor for me to speak here tonight because this is an organization which I have a great deal of respect for. I've been a member for about 8 months, and I really appreciate the fine talks and lectures that this group puts together on subjects of science and free thought and living an evidence-based life. I only hope I can live up to that expectation. So, like Brian said, this is an avocation and a passion of mine. I'm not an expert. I've collected here some information which is important to me, but I do hope that this will be a little more of a discussion than a lecture. And if I say something wrong, if I misspeak, please bring it up, point it out. I think everybody benefits from that. So the first question is, how many people here find that evolution is the best explanation for the profusion of life we see around here? Okay, that's just about everybody. Is there anybody who thinks that feels that there's a different theory that better explains it? Anybody? Okay, fine. That's what I was expecting, that everybody here would understand evolution. I'm not going to preach to the choir, but I do want to focus a little bit. Nothing will be on the facts of evolution. You already know that. You're all well versed. But I would like to talk a little bit about the emotional reasons that people reject evolution, and so that we can learn to talk about these things effectively, and we can more address these emotional issues. So my second question is, raise your hand if you believe that snowflakes exist. Does everybody believe snowflakes exist? Okay, good. Is there anybody here who does not believe that snowflakes exist? Okay, we got a wise guy back here. I'm going to expect some questions from you later. Let me figure out how to advance this forward. Okay, so my motivation started about 10 years ago at the Kitzmiller versus Dover area school district, where the school board decided that they would teach creationism, or a type of creationism known as intelligent design, in public schools. And from my own background, I have a pretty good grounding in science at home. Both my parents have degrees in science. I followed the path. I got a degree in physics. I got another degree in computer science. I'm a computer scientist by trade, so that's what I do. But I'm very open-minded. If someone wants to believe anti-intellectual and anti-scientific things, I'm pretty much okay with that. You don't have much control over your beliefs. But indoctrinating school children to theories where there's no evidence and no consensus, and they present it cloaked as a scientific theory, well, that goes too far. And to me, evolution's pretty obvious, and it should be obvious to anybody, but apparently it's not obvious to 42% of the US population. So I spoke with some people, listened to a lot of argumentation, and people are okay with the sun being the center of the solar system. And they're okay with the world being round. I mean, there's all sorts of scientific facts that they're okay with, but evolution has this special place. People really have a gut reaction to it. There's something they're very uncomfortable with. They're uncomfortable with the way that it creates itself, the way that it just appears out of nothing. So that's what we're going to do, is talk a little bit about the emotional reaction to this. So about the time of the Bill Nye-Kinham debate last year, there were a bunch of photos circulated mocking the evolutionary stance, and this is one. Does not the second law of thermodynamics disprove evolution? Now, you're all well versed in it here, so you already know the answer is the Earth is not a closed system. So you know that, but there's a couple things about this question. I mean, he obviously respects science to some degree. I mean, he's basically trying to come up with a scientific answer to it. And the thing about the second law of thermodynamics is that it basically says that in a closed system, entropy always increases. And entropy is a measure of how disordered a system is. So an increase of entropy always means a decrease in order. So from a naive point of view, if you look at the second law, it seems to say that entropy never decreases. Therefore, order can never increase. So from a very naive point of view, now it turns out that that's not the truth, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But it is rather confusing that that conclusion can't be made. Another one of these slides was, what mechanism has science discovered that evidences an increase in genetic information seen in any genetic mutation or evolutionary process? The quick answer is all the time. We see this all the time. But think about what's going on in the mind of the person asking this question is that we all think of mutations as being degradations of what's there. It's always it's a breakdown. How can something become more organized? How can it become better? And this is this is a very surprising aspect. Now, she talks about information here, and I did go back. I'm sorry, I did get a question on the site, and this is a very colloquial use of the term information. And what she really means here is that genetic information is the amount of different encoded useful sequences. So basically, the total amount of order in the thing. Higher life forms are obviously more organized. So in this talk, I'm going to avoid information because I did go back to Claude Shannon. I looked at information theory, and it turns out his definition of information doesn't really fit this. And I just don't want to go there tonight. I'll try to use the term order and organized because that's really what this talk is about. Last one, if God didn't create everything, how did the first single-celled organism originate? By chance. And of course the answer is, yeah, of course, by chance. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how chance plays a role in all of this. And I think it's kind of an honest misconception. I think there's a lot of people that sort of have a mental block. I think we all would have a mental block if we hadn't thought it through and gotten past that, you know what I mean? So if we can address this misconception, I think we can help a lot of people to understand. So I did go to talkorigins.org, and these are the 5 major misconceptions about evolution. I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm just going to touch on the one about the second law of thermodynamics. That's really common. And the other one is how people understand and perceive this notion of random chance. So you've all seen this argument before. A watch demands a watchmaker. A painting demands a painter. And I think what people mean by this is there's a lot of intricate detail there. You know, this is not just a pile of dirt. You know, if you go wandering around in the wilderness, it's not random materials. It's been organized. It's been put together. You know, it's nice and shiny. And in our own experience with the things that we have in our own life, basically things wear out. Everything wears out. Everything that you have, think about it. Your car is going to wear out. Your house is going to wear out. You're going to have to get a new roof. Your shoes wear out. Your clothes wear out. Roads wear out. All of this stuff has to be maintained if you're going to keep it good. This experience dominates our intuition. Everything we deal with follows a pattern, something like this. If it's nice and shiny, it's new. It was just made. And then after time goes on, it's going to get duller, it's going to get worn out, the quality is going to go down, however you measure quality, and eventually you're going to discard it. So essentially everything in our experience goes like this. So you can understand how, if you think this is a general rule of all things, that you could sort of say, well, if it's nice and new and shiny, it must have just been made by something, okay? And I'm going to talk about how things can come about without being made by something. But it's interesting, if you look around, if you do a Google search for the Law of Decay, you'll find a bunch of hits like this. If it's about thermodynamics, they all come from Christian sites. So I'll read this one. The second law of thermodynamics describes the basic principles familiar in everyday life. It's partially a universal law of decay, the ultimate cause of why everything ultimately falls apart and disintegrates over time. Material things are not eternal. Everything appears to change eventually, and chaos increases. Nothing stays as fresh as the day one buys it. Clothing becomes faded, threadbare, and ultimately returns to dust. Now, this is not what the second law of thermodynamics is about, which is really about statistical disorder of matter and it's the states that it tends to go into. But this is how they interpret it. This is what they think the second law of thermodynamics is about. And that it's, if you see this as a universal principle, that everything wears out and everything decays, then you understand where their point of view comes from. But the one thing, a couple things, one of my first points, at the atomic scale, things don't wear out, okay? Atoms can go into molecules. They can break out of those molecules, then go off into other molecules, and they can do this millions of times. As far as I know, they can do it an infinite number of times. Atoms never wear out. Molecules, I'm sorry? Radioactivity. They can transform from one type of isotope to another type of isotope, but they don't sort of just wear down in the same, there's no friction at that level. So crystals can form and they can break apart, but at that level, they can do this, many times. And by the way, molecules can break, and things can break, but this concept of wearing out isn't there. And more importantly, they exhibit something which I call auto-creation, the ability to create all by themselves. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But I promised to talk about snowflakes. And it's funny that Brian said, yeah, we had to wait for the summer. We don't have snowflakes in the winter here either, Brian. But look at this. Behold the marvel that is a snowflake. It is marvelously detailed. We all know that it's got 6-sided symmetry. Sometimes they have 12-sided symmetry, it turns out. And there's a lot of detail in there. In many ways, there's almost as much detail in there as in that watch I showed earlier. How does it do that? I mean, how does it's not perfect. If you look at it closely, you'll see that there's some problems in it, but it's really pretty amazing. So let's spend a moment to understand why a snowflake has this kind of shape, and then we'll talk about how that affects everything else. So it starts with a water molecule. You've got 2 hydrogens. You've got an oxygen. The oxygen's bigger than the hydrogen. The oxygen tends to steal the electrons from the hydrogen, so it tends to be negatively charged. The hydrogen tends to be positively charged. They tend to sit on the sort of the surface at this angle of about 106 degrees. Depends on whether it's frozen or not. And because you have charges and they're displaced by a distance, you're going to have an electric field. So this is an electric dipole field. So every little molecule has a little electric field around it, and this interacts with all the other little molecules. And when they get packed together, they tend to pack together in this sort of way, which is kind of a hexagonal and kind of a tetrahedral organization of things. But this is where the 6-sided symmetry of crystals come from, because just the physicality of the molecule itself and the field around it tends to pack them like this. So what happens when you consider a bunch of these all coming together? Well, this is where it starts to get to be a bit complicated. The electric fields of all of these little molecules are going to either add up or cancel out, depending, on exactly how they're arranged. And so you'll have these field lines coming out of the crystal. And I looked to see if anybody had calculated exactly what those field lines look like, and I don't actually have that calculation, so this is conceptual. But we do know from empirical evidence that around the crystal, you will have certain areas where new molecules will like to join, they'll like to stick, and there's places where they don't. And particularly the flat surfaces where it's flat, you've got this sort of red indication saying that that's where molecules are not likely to stick. Whereas on the places where it's rough or curved, they tend to more likely to stick there. And crystals don't grow in, a complete thing. There'll always be a little bit of rough spots. And the thing is that it's in those rough spots that tend to attract the molecules. So water molecules are hitting this thing all the time up in the atmosphere. You've got this growing crystal, and it's bouncing off of there. But every now and then they stick, and they're going to tend to stick in the places that are rough. And that's going to end up filling out the crystal and tending to make it whole. And then once you've got a nice, perfect crystal, what happens? Well, of course, it's going to go on to the points and things like that. And that may cause another rough area that gets filled in, or depending on the situation, it may not. And that's how you end up with something like this. And you can imagine how this grew. It started as a little hexagonal plate, and it grew as a plate until this crystal moved into another region where the temperature or the pressure of water changed, and it started growing these dendrites, the little spiky things, and so it started growing as dendrites after that. And it turns out that depending on the saturation of the water in the air and the temperature that you're at, you'll get these different things. I mean, we're familiar with the hexagonal plates and the dendrite ones, but it'll also form these columns and these hollow columns and these needles. And basically, one single crystal will drift through different regions and grow in different ways at different times. But in fact, the entire crystal, because it keeps its integrity, it tends to grow on all the points the same way. So this one started in an area where you had these dendrites, and eventually it drifted into an area where it wanted to form plates, and those plates started growing, out here on the edge. So that's what allows all snowflakes to be unique and to be organized. But and the whole idea is there's now hopefully no magic behind how snowflakes form. But let's talk a little bit about randomness. I don't know if you've seen this trope before. They'll say that for DNA to form or for an eyeball to form, that would be as likely as a tornado going through a junkyard and putting together a jumbo jet. Okay, this is an extremely specious argument. It belies a complete misunderstanding about how randomness works in building these things. But let's play along with that just a little bit. Let's think about that. What's the probability of a snowflake just forming? That is, all of the molecules in a snowflake just come together and make the form of a snowflake. A typical small snowflake has about 10 to the 18th molecules. You can do a naive calculation of the probability. You could say, here's a molecule. It could be anywhere in this room, but it's right here. So what's the chance of that? Let's say 1 in 100. And the molecule next to it. It could be anywhere in the room, but it's right next to it. And so on. You multiply all those probabilities together, and you're going to get a number that's, like a 1 with 10 to the 40 zeros after it. It's such a ridiculously large number. It's not even worth talking about. And the point is, of course, snowflakes are not assembled by just randomly bringing all the molecules together. Snowflakes, there's a very, very definite process to how a snowflake is built. And again, I talked about the forces, and it's interesting that the randomness of the gas plays a role. Because if you didn't have the random motion of the molecules in the gas, the crystal itself wouldn't grow. So you need some random motion, but you need a selector function. You need some sort of a process that selects the molecules that come into the right place. And if you put those together, okay, a little bit of random motion with a process, you can end up with something that is more organized than you had before. You can have order come out of disorder because of the combination of these two things. And this happens all the time. This happens all the time. So you end up with like a snowflake like this one. So let's talk a little bit about existence and creation. Obviously, for a given snowflake, there was a point in time when there was no snowflake. And then later on, there was a time when there was a snowflake, and it existed. And I asked you early on whether you believe that snowflakes existed, and everybody said yes. So it did exist. And we call that creation. So the snowflake was created. And then later on, it's going to melt, it's going to go away, and you don't have a little ghost of a snowflake there. It's gone. It is destroyed. So what does it mean for a snowflake to exist? Well, think about the difference between these two environments. Now, this is, one is before the snowflake comes into existence, and the other one is after the snowflake exists. It's interesting. It's the same molecules. I mean, over here, you got a bunch of molecules. And then now you just got the molecules organized into this little pattern over here. No molecules were harmed in the making of this snowflake. They're all there. So that's the only difference is how organized the molecules are. But if if we look at it, we would say, now there is a snowflake. It exists. It didn't exist before. There was no proto-snowflake over here. So it was created. Now, how did it get created? Well, but focus for just a moment that the molecules are already there, no new molecules formed, but that form is important. The form is what we consider the existence of the snowflake, and that form will persist. And a lot of the things we interact with on a daily basis are just like that. They're made out of things, they're made out of matter that's been around for millions of years, but now it's in a new form. And your body is the same way. I mean, our body is, the carbon that's in your body has been part of many plants and animals before you, many, many times. You probably already know that every breath you take, you breathe in millions of atoms, which Leonardo da Vinci breathed in his lifetime, and millions of atoms from everybody else who lived to a ripe old age. We think of our bodies as being something separate from the universe, but actually we should think of it really as a flow. Matter flows in and out of our body, but the body is an organization of that matter that holds its form for a certain period of time. So that's, again, existence and creation. How did the snowflake get created? Well, we certainly know we don't need little fairies running around carving the ice up. And this is what they thought a few thousand years ago, was that you had some sort of special magic sort of animus that would go in and carve these things up. I mean, for example, Jack Frost is the name we give to the guy that supposedly paints your windows with frost. But nobody believes this today. Okay, even the Institute for Creation Research, if you go there, they don't believe that there's little fairies flying around carving the ice. They know there's a natural process for it. So, nobody really believes this. But how did the snowflake get created? Well, of course, the right conditions had to exist. There's no question about that. Snowflakes don't form on the beach in Jamaica. Okay? They tend to form way up in clouds, with water vapor floating around with the right temperature and all that kind of stuff. But when you think about it, the clouds and the winds, they're all acting sort of randomly. They don't actually cause the shape of the snowflake to come into existence. Now, I asked a bunch of my intelligent friends, and they all said, it's a speck of dust, okay, that causes the snowflake. And it's true that most snowflakes have a speck of dust or a piece of pollen at the core of them, but the best you can say is that dust triggers it. It triggers the forming of a snowflake, but the snowflake itself doesn't depend on the speck of dust, not in any realistic way. And of course, there's the electrostatic field that's critical to the state. I would say, and I put to you, that molecules, it's the molecules and their motions that build the snowflake. And these are the very same molecules that are in the snowflake. Okay? And that's why I say that snowflakes create themselves. Now, again, I did make a comparison between creation and organization. Let me go to that moment, but just think about this for a moment. You might think it's unfair to say that the snowflake creates itself, but you certainly can say that it was not created by an external agent. There was nothing that came in and put the snowflake together. It's the molecules themselves, it's the physical properties of those molecules and the electric fields around them that cause them to go into that particular form. Now, auto-creation is very unsettling. Okay, the idea that something creates itself is very hard to accept, and intelligent people, because how can it create itself if it doesn't exist yet, right? So intuitively, this never happens, and if you feel that way, you're in very, very good company. But part of what's going on here is that your mind wants to find a reason for everything that comes into existence. I mean, if my driveway is covered with snow, I want to know why, okay? I don't just want to know that the snow created itself there. In many ways, this creation, we could call it self-organization, if you want. And if you're more comfortable with that, call it self-organizing, because these molecules organize themselves into crystals. And this is an emergent behavior of the complex system, which is the gas that the snowflakes come from. So we're talking about emergence here and the fact that organization can come from disorganization all by itself without any external, certainly no external intelligence needs to be involved, but really no external thing at all. The crystals form on their own. And it turns out this happens all the time. There's lots of things. Let me give you some other examples. One is whirlpools. Okay, so what is a whirlpool? I mean, it's water. Okay, it's water that falls, and as it falls, other water falls behind it, and more water falls behind it. It's a pattern of the water flowing. There's nothing else to a whirlpool than the pattern of water. And there's no denying that it exists. I mean, it's right there. But there's nothing there besides the water that is flowing, right? And these whirlpools will form on their own. Of course, you have to write conditions for it. So obviously this is some sort of a dam thing and the water's flowing through there. But nothing comes, we don't need to imagine a little elf hollowing out the water there, pulling the water out and making that. It forms literally on its own because of the way that the water interacts with itself in the presence and the way it flows. Another example is storms, hurricanes. How do hurricanes form? Well, we know that it's caused by the sun shining on the ocean, the water vapor rises, the warmer water vapor rises, the earth is spinning, the Coriolis effect tends to spin the air in the northern hemisphere in the counterclockwise direction. And this spinning builds and builds. As more water vapor goes up into the air, it spins faster and faster. There's no single thing that starts a storm. Storms just start on their own. And it's basically the matter, the matter that's in there, the air that's in there, it's the same air that's in your atmosphere. I mean, it's the same stuff as the atmosphere, but now it's a storm, and it's a different thing, and it can actually do a lot of destruction. And eventually that storm will disappear. I mean, when it's done, there's no little pieces of hurricane sitting around. Right? So it forms on its own, and it is an organization. All it is an organization of the matter in the air there. So I've got a couple other examples. This one's an entire talk all on its own, but there's a lot of similarity between the way that snowflakes and storms and whirlpools form and the way that consciousness forms. As you well know, neurons are designed to create connections, but the consciousness comes out of those connections. It forms out of those connections. I really liked the talk that Frank gave us a couple of weeks ago. He talked about consciousness and two layers of consciousness, the primary consciousness, and then on top of that, the language consciousness. And I think it's really interesting how that all comes about. But I see consciousness forming in very much the same way that these other self-organizing things appear. You need some randomness, and you need a selecting function, and that can allow order to appear when it wasn't there before. That's another example of things around us all the time that self-organize. Plants. I mean, they start as a little teeny twig. They grow up into this huge, giant tree. What are they doing? Well, they're taking carbon out of the air. They're taking carbon dioxide, and they're incorporating it into the trunk of the tree and into the leaves of the tree. It's organizing that material into the form of the body there. And of course, well, this is life. Life is special. It's got a special thing. But we know how all these processes work, but that's really what's happening, is that it's becoming more organized on its own. Now, when we talk about life, I talked a lot about this self-organizing behavior. For life, you need a self-replicating behavior, right? You've got to be able to make copies of yourself. It's not life unless you can spin off copies. So you also need this self-replicating piece up here. But I think the self-replicating piece doesn't work unless you have a basic property of self-organizing that exists in the universe. So it sort of uses that. And of course, you put that all together, you've got this wonderful life tree because you've got the ability for order to appear spontaneously, and then that gets repeated. And you all know how evolution works, the survival of the fittest and all that. So I thought one of the more interesting things that's happened in the last couple of years, about 2 years ago, Jeremy England, an MIT professor, published this paper, Statistical Physics of Self-Replication. He's a mathematician. But what he did was he looked at the mathematical basis for systems to form, for large number of particles to form replicating patterns. And this was covered in a Scientific American article about a year and a half ago. As you might know, the laws of thermodynamics have to do with statistics. Basically, you put gas in a chamber, you make the chamber bigger, the gas is going to spread out because it's just far, far more likely for it to do that. And when you're talking about 10 to the 23rd molecules, it becomes incredibly more likely that it will spread out. Well, as far as I know, what Dr. England did was he was the first one to sort of mathematically model, let's take a look at what it would take to make a replicating structure, something that makes copies of itself. And what he found out is that large particles will form, large pools of particles will form these replicating structures, and those replicating structures are lower energy states. In fact, there's a tendency for them to form replicating structures. And this comes out of the math. This isn't some special property of our universe or some, the fine structure constant or something like that. This comes just out of the math of statistics around large things. The first one's a quote from him. This means that clumps of atoms surrounded by a bath at some temperature, like the atmosphere or the ocean, should tend over time to arrange themselves to resonate better and better with sources of work in their environment. The second quote's from the Scientific American. England argues that under certain conditions, matter will spontaneously organize. And this tendency will account for many of the things, living as well as inanimate structures. So I think it's really kind of exciting that the math is showing us that it's more likely than our intuition tells us. I mean, if you've looked at the mechanisms behind DNA and how DNA replicates, it's amazing. I mean, it's incredible how amazing that whole mechanism works. It's hard to believe, and our intuition is that that's going to be very, very difficult to come about. But he basically says, if you start with a random clump of atoms, if you shine light on it for long enough, and that may mean billions of years, okay, so it's a long time, but if you shine light on it long enough, it should not be surprising that you get a plant. And that's what this is coming from the math, which I think is really fascinating. So there'll be a lot of more good work on this, I hope, in the future. Keep your eyes open on that understanding of all that. So I think I've come full circle, giving you an understanding, but I wanted to touch a few of these questions that people have, uncertainties about evolution, and basically come up with some answers that we could come back with. So the first one is the statement that everything wears out. Well, not on a molecular scale, they don't. Atomic and molecular interactions can happen billions of times without wearing down. They can break, they can change, that's part of the natural thing, but there's no friction at that level. And so to apply what we know at our level of existence and to apply that to molecules, to basically say that, I've never seen, something in my house automatically assemble itself, and then to apply that to molecules, it's not really a fair thing to do. So it is a different realm. We should treat it differently. A watch demands a watchmaker. A painting demands a painter. Well, of course they do. These are man-made things. These are not molecular level things. These are not complex systems. These don't behave according to those natural rules. Natural phenomena are far, far grander than a watch or a painting. Things don't just appear on their own. Right? And this one goes back to, I think all of us feel that way. When have you seen something just appear on its own? Well, they do around us. Snowflakes appear. Nobody has to go in and make the snowflakes. Nobody makes a hurricane. Nobody makes whirlpools. We don't need pixies. We don't need elves. We don't need fairies. We don't need any other intelligent agent to bring these into existence. And there's lots of examples of this. Things don't organize themselves without an external intelligent agent acting upon them. So if that's your position, then I would ask the question, which intelligent agent is responsible for creating snowflakes? Which intelligent agent creates frost on the windows? Which one spins hurricanes? Which one makes leaves appear on trees? and one of my favorites, which one causes a valley to form in just the right way to deliver water to the ocean? All of these, there's a process. For all of these, there's a process. And once again, the main point here is that a little bit of randomness with a selecting process, and you can have organization appear out of something that is not organized. Universal law of decay. Okay? There is no such thing. Okay? The tendency toward net disorder, that is increased entropy, is not decay as experienced by human-sized man-made things. Okay? It's a slightly different concept. Don't confuse man-made things with natural phenomenon. Every system left to its own devices will always tend to move from order to disorder. Well, this is partially true. It's net entropy will increase. It's net entropy that will increase, and that's in a closed system. The interesting thing is that parts of a system can become spontaneously organized, and that's what happens with snowflakes. If you want to, and there's no violation of the second law of thermodynamics. In one part, a snowflake is forming, and as it forms, it's exothermic. It actually gives off heat. Well, that heat is increasing the randomness someplace else. So what's happening in the universe is that one part starts to get more organized, another part gets less organized. Now, the net of this is going to be toward net disorder, because that's what we know that the second law of thermodynamics says. But there's no reason that parts can't spontaneously organize while other parts are becoming more disorganized. And that's kind of a very surprising aspect of the universe. That I think when I started out, I didn't really realize that. But once you realize this is happening around us, it helps you to understand a lot of things about what's in our world. One more, evolution is contrary to God. I didn't talk about this in this lecture. And so I didn't really cover it here, but I wanted to include it just because there are a lot of people out there that feel that if they buy into evolution, if they admit to agreeing with evolution, they will be banned from their religion, they will be ostracized by their family, they will lose their friends, they will be shunned by their friends. It's sad, of course, that for having a certain thought or for having a certain belief that people will act this way. But it's a very real fact in the world that we live in, and so there's many people who simply feel that they can't go there. And I think we need to make it clear that evolution says nothing. It is not a proof for the non-existence of God. It says nothing about God. It's just about how new species appear, and we need to keep reiterating that so that we can free people from that, having to make that choice. So that's essentially it. I covered some of the emotional reactions to evolution. I talked about the law of decay and how it's very intuitive but false. I talked a bit about the details of how snowflakes form, and then we talked about existence. It's really just organization. And about creation, which is just about getting organized. And then, do these things, snowflakes, really self-organize? I believe they do, and I gave several other examples of things that self-organize. Then we talked a bit about life and replicating structures and about how there seems to be indication that forming of replicating structures is more common than we expected. And then I covered some common questions and answers. So with that, maybe we can turn this into a discussion.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Let's give him a round of applause. That was great. Nice job. Question from Werner.
Well, you sort of discussed this, but I think often there's an external input of energy somewhere that's not obvious. So, for example, in the snowflakes, you talked about the wind moving the water molecules from different locations, and of course that wind arose through solar energy inputting onto the earth somewhere else and moving things around, and likewise the plants growing, there's a lot of solar energy input, so that's a really, really good important point, and I realized there were a couple statements I was supposed to make in here that I didn't. But yeah, while these things self-organize, they need energy input. I mean, it's not like they do it in a vacuum and that they do it all by themselves. And as you pointed out, it is the energy that drives the clouds, that forms the clouds, and that drives these molecules moving around like this, that allows them to find
those crystals and to find the positions in the crystals and to stick there. So that energy drives that organization.
This is maybe a little bit nitpicky, but one of the first things you said was that you thought that evolution was evident, self-evident or obvious. If that's the case, how come we had to wait until 1859 and Darwin? Why didn't the Greeks come up with it?
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. I think it's obvious only after you invest the time to sit down and sort of understanding it. And I do believe that there are some barriers that you have to get over. So if I said it was obvious, I didn't mean to say it should have been obvious to everybody. I think at this point in time, now that we know about it, I think to me it's very clear, and there's no question about it. But you're right. I mean, it's a relatively new thing and was not obvious to everybody in history.
Actually, I disagree with that statement and that conclusion, because I think that evolution has been very obvious, and the fact of that is the agricultural revolution that happened more than 10,000 years ago, because people figured out that they could manipulate the future generations of plants and also domestication of animals that happened even more than 10,000 years ago. So maybe we didn't have it in the form of a theory, but we sure understood some of the mechanics of how evolution actually worked, and we harnessed that to our own benefit tens of thousands of years before Darwin kind of published his theory. So I take exception.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. The theory of natural selection, we often think of that as coming from Darwin, but Empedocles was a pre-Socratic philosopher about 400 years before BC. He had the idea of natural selection. He thought that there were these animals, there were like three-legged animals and two-legged animals and four-legged animals, and the ones with the better, with the better equipment survived. Unfortunately, Aristotle thought this was such a crazy idea, he refused to put it in his encyclopedia.
Oh, we got a few more up here. Hang on.
So the whole bit about evolution not disproving God, it limits God very much so, depending on how you define evolution, how you define God. And because God is such an amorphous concept, you leave out a lot. And I'll be covering this more in the debate we'll be having. When is it, Brian? End of next month, I think. Yeah, we're going to do a does the Christian God exist debate.
Okay,
so
good.
we'll be coming up on this, because evolution is a lousy process for a kind, loving God. So it just puts limits on what a God can do. And you're right. I think beginning with people, you need to let them know it doesn't push their God out of the way. But it's far more complex.
It shouldn't. And you're absolutely right, is that some people, their beliefs are, absolutely require this other thing over here. And so to them, it's a threat. But I think to the most Americans who basically buy into science, science is very popular in America, but 85% of the Americans believe that science is the nice way to find things. It's just in the area of evolution, they find it difficult to believe. So, but anyway, I look forward to that debate. I'll be taking my position, and you can take yours.
My name's Carl. I'd like to ask you, in the history of everything, certain things seem to attract the same. And so even in humans, I try to equate everything you're talking about into our human problems on the planet, and we attract people the same. We have people, one country with total different beliefs than the people in the other country, and I'm looking at the way we attract things. I was at a park up in Santa Rosa where there was two types of cranes. There were gray cranes, these birds, and the white ones. And even though they were both cranes, they were packed together, the grays on one side and the white ones on the other side. And I was wondering that everything is magnetic in some way, starting with that snowflake down to human beings. And we, fortunately, our planet has started to integrate as human beings better than animals do, but I just tried to turn that all into human terms. Mm-hmm. And it's still a puzzle because I can't figure out how it initially attracted to itself, like a snowflake.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, but physics. Okay.
I think the problem that believers have with the concept of evolution is acceptance that we, who are they consider to be a special creation,
Yes.
could have come from some other which they conceive to be lesser form of existence than what we are.
Nobody wants to admit that we're all animals. That's the truth.
Well, not only to admit that we're all animals, but to admit that, yes, our ancestors were more ape-like than what we are today.
Wow.
And you see a lot of that in a lot of the criticism that was around the time of Darwin, you know, where Darwin was pictured as presenting people as a kind of ape, which indeed we are, but we don't admit it.
Yeah, that's right. It was a great article a couple years ago in, I think it was in Mother Jones, why it's easier to believe in God than it is to believe in evolution. And he cited 7 things, and one of them was that, the human exceptionalism. We have to believe that we're separate. That's just one of the things that our psyche makes us do. And there's a bunch of others. There were 6 others like that, and it was a really interesting article.
So the evolution and going from one thing to another is great, but still the things creating themselves, how was the very first things created? You know, it's like the Big Bang wasn't evolved from anything.
Yeah, so again, and I purposely didn't cover Big Bang here because this is all about after Big Bang. So I can't say, at least with this, I can't say anything about the Big Bang. But after that, all I'm trying to say is that things will organize themselves. Order will come naturally from disorder. And it happens all the time. And so there's no, I mean, the first thing that became organized just happened to be, you know, the first snowflake after the Big Bang, you know, that sort of thing.
Just wanted to point out that anybody who doesn't believe that things organize themselves should stop vacuuming under their bed for about 3 months, and they'd be quickly disabused of that notion. Same thing for cobwebs. If you don't dust up high in your house long enough, you're going to have long strands of very nice molecules hanging down, and those will be much more organized than the things that they came from.
Yes.
I think that part of what you didn't touch on in your talk was the point number 5 is the one that gets to me, is that the theory of evolution, and it's just a theory, which is a complete misunderstanding of that word, and it's something that you touched on early in the talk about people misusing concepts and misusing scientific words. And of course, a theory in scientific terms is nothing like the concept of the phrase "in theory." Which obviously means something that just, you know, might or might not happen, but a scientific theory obviously is something that's been tested. In reality, the in theory would be much better as phrased as in hypothesis. But just wanted to say, I think that you bring up some excellent points about the way people misuse language in their arguments to disprove scientific stuff.
Yeah, these are the 5 major misconceptions. This last one, evolution is only a theory. It hasn't been proven. And of course, you all know that theories can be proven, and they're still a theory. And so you're right, that's a misuse of that term. And yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Keith. I got a question. It's my understanding, and my observation, that human beings look for patterns, and they ignore non-patterns. And I'd like to get your feeling about how that ties into what you've been talking about tonight.
Okay, human beings look for patterns, and they recognize things, and that's kind of where I was going with this existence thing, because the snowflake, its existence is just a pattern. It's just a form. We don't just say, oh, there's a clump of water molecules. You know, we don't say that. We actually think of that as something that is distinct. And the same thing, I talked about how we should think of our bodies more as a flow of material through it. But the fact is, we think of ourselves as being separate, unique units, and we think of each other as being, you know, separate, distinct things. And that's a distinction that our mind puts on things. So we draw that line between whether something is part of you or not. I mean, think about it. Your hair is part of you until you go to the barber, and then it's no longer part of you. And that distinction is really, really important in how we understand the world, and our mind sort of puts that color on it there. So once again, if you step back from it and you say creation is just organizing things, then this idea of auto-creation becomes much, much easier to believe.
All right, is there one last question?
Maybe it's not so much a question, but more an observation talking about randomness. If everything about self-auto-creation is basically a constellation of the environment together with the implicit magnetic or electronic attractions within, isn't that randomness? And if you drill further down, not from a molecular atomic level, but down to, let's say, string theory, which is also about randomness, doesn't that mean that everything, including ourselves, is basically random?
So I explained that things are formed by, the randomness plays an important role in it, but randomness together with a process, a selector process, and that's what causes organization to spontaneously appear. And so those forms, those forms are created. Those forms do interact with each other. So I don't quite know what you mean by everything is randomness. I think randomness plays a role, but in these complex systems where you have trillions of things interacting with trillions of things, we see patterns and forms emerge from that, and that emergence is, I think, not randomness. I think it's organized.
All right, let's give Keith another round of applause. Thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you all.
Thank you.